I wanted to say before I begin my sermon that I am not aware of any ancestors that I have in the United States from north of the Mason-Dixon line. So I hope for any of you Southerners that will give me at least a little bit of credibility to begin with. But the beginning sentence I put some importance on for my sermon proper, if you will. I am not guilty of being white. And neither are the people who disagree with me about Confederate monuments or anything else guilty of being white. But as we'll see in certain ways as we go through today, I'm not innocent of being white either, which means the fact that I am white has made a difference in my life. And for me, that is so obvious as to not need explanation, except that when we talk about larger issues, often the obvious gets clouded in ideology and mythology and the blarings of the people that I call megaphonies, because they're hot airists who get access to a megaphone of one kind or another. So what we need to do, in my opinion, is to bring it back down to our individual and collective lives, what we actually are living through in the present as we look back to our past with an eye toward our future. And the first thing I want to emphasize in terms of that is that we are very much shaped by our past, that our past is alive in us. Some people would say, just forget it, it's all in the past, but the past we're talking about is still very much a part of my life. And so we can't just forget the past. But that also means if someone else's life is shaped by a past that has values they describe as heritage, whose values I might disagree with by the time it comes to typical conversation, I need to somehow find a way to recognize that their life has a heritage and that I have to find a way to acknowledge and even appreciate them in their life if we're going to move forward in a united state or a more united state. So that's what we want to look to this morning. We want to look to a divisive issue in order to find an occasion and a means of how we might come together. Not in spite of, but even because of the fact that our collective history is lived individually in many different and sometimes conflicting ways. So I'm going to suggest that it is not helpful for us to pit fact against what we think is mythology. That it is not helpful for us to go through and lecture people a whole lot about when the statues were put up and why and that sort of thing. That's important for that information to come out. I'm really talking about when we're speaking with our neighbors, when we're speaking in city council meetings about what should happen next, that to confront in that spirit seems to me to harden the differences and to invite more trumpery. And so in lieu of that, I want us to look to a different way of approaching from our own lives, from where we really are. And I'll begin with my own life. I was born in Montgomery County, Maryland, on the other side of the District of Columbia from Anacostia, which is one of the blackest and poorest places one could have been in the year of my birth. And I want to suggest that my life has been very different in its trajectory from what my Anacostian twins' life might have been. And if we look at these things historically, and if we look at the causes and effects that carry through history, whatever neighborhoods we're born in, if we look at what economists call earning histories and measure the economic consequences of those things, isn't it reasonable to suppose that my daughter would have had opportunities that the child of someone born in Anacostia on the same day would not have had? Isn't it reasonable to think that if I enjoyed any benefits or privileges, whether earned or not, that that had effects on what I was able to do in my family? That that had an effect on what neighborhood I lived in when I was of childbearing age? That that had an effect on my daughter's neighborhood, on my daughter's schools, on my daughter's education and prospects for employment. If I'm not guilty of being white, she's not guilty of being white, but I'm suggesting that in a sense, that privilege of my whiteness was something I was passing on without intentionally trying to discriminate against anybody. I wasn't trying to be a supremacist at all, not my values whatsoever. And yet, when my daughter went to a predominantly black high school, it was not because that was where we lived. She was impelled to that magnet by less obvious indications of white privilege. She was impelled in part by a skill set and an easiness with the culture of white schooling that included some pretty sophisticated stuff on time management and test taking, among other things. So her success in that school, in that program, which at that time and still is one of the very best international baccalaureate programs in the country, it wasn't the tuition money of this public school that was the difference between what she brought to it, what another person with comparable intelligence, equally motivated, working as hard or harder, might not have had the success that she has had because of these less tangible factors that come sometimes with our culture. So when I look from my life back to our collective life together, if we can see that white privilege has played a role in how I've advanced and even how my daughter's advanced, the only question becomes then, how do we put a stop to the differences that follow that? How do we end the causal chains of slavery rattling through our history? How do we change that? And to get at that, I would love to turn back to history again. Is this water for the rocks, or may I have a sip? I don't mind sharing the water with rocks, and there's certain things that are better on the rocks. So I want to look to the capital of the slave trade Southern Confederacy. I want to look to Charleston, South Carolina. From the earlier days of slavery, when that was maybe the central place for slaves to ship through in the United States and be disseminated to their various owners. Skip ahead to 1961, the centennial of the beginning of the Civil War, and South Carolina had a centennial plan in Charleston where, for the first time in a while, they put up a Confederate flag on the State House as part of that celebration. The governor of the time, Strom Thurmond, was a great advocate of states' rights, of Southern heritage, and of all kinds of things that included the value of segregation. So that's when that flag went up over that State House, was 1961. It just so happened that it never came down. Flash ahead from there. From 1961, when I was just a little kid, to a couple years ago, 2015. I'm sorry, I choke up over this every time, but Mother Emanuel, African Methodist Episcopal Church. 9 people murdered by Dylann Roof while they were worshiping. And very shortly after that, the governor of South Carolina, who had been opposed to bringing that flag down, stood on the steps of that State House and said, it's time for that flag to come down. She said, that flag represents our past, but it does not represent what the future of South Carolina stands for. And so this Republican conservative woman, who is now our ambassador to the United States, saw through a different perspective what that flag looked like. And instead of seeing it as an innocuous historical fact, could see in a new way what that flag would look like to many African Americans. And I want to suggest that what may well have precipitated that change was the worshipers and the families of those murdered women and men, as they forgave Dylann Roof, the murderer, one who said, if God forgives you, I forgive you. One woman whose father was murdered and said his philosophy was that kindness always wins. In that spirit, none of my family want him to be put to death. We want him to live because we believe that no person is ever beyond redemption. We believe that he may yet have the kind of spiritual awakening that will allow him to change the lives of others for the good. That is really, really powerful stuff. And I would encourage any of my secular humanist brethren who sometimes take umbrage at Christianity as a general institution to consider those particular human Christian values lived by those particular Christian worshipers. Because for me, that is the sense we need to have. Now, the philosopher Immanuel Kant said you cannot command love. You can command respect ethically, but not love. And one might say the same of forgiveness. We can't expect forgiveness, but can we at least move toward an expectation of empathy, of us being with each other in this history as we live ourselves forward into what we hope will be a better future? Politically, of course, we're a mixed-up country and always have been, more divided now than we were in the days of Vietnam by many contemporary polls. And so I want to suggest that a value that conservatives have always looked to, and not only in the United States, is the past being conserved. What was a value in the past ought not be lost because somebody's gang of however many decides that the people have a better idea, or because some bureaucratic committee or whatever else, there are values that need to be preserved. And the conservative impetus, according to many historians, is to be wary of changes because they might throw away what was a value in the past. On the other hand, if conservatives look to the past, progressives, like our previous president, look to the future in terms of how we can become better, in a sense that I want to turn to Abraham Lincoln for. Abraham Lincoln being someone that conservatives and progressives alike can celebrate as an icon of our American democracy. One of my favorite history books is Gary Will's Lincoln at Gettysburg. And Gary Wills makes an argument there I found tremendously significant, that by turning not to the Constitution, but to the Declaration of Independence as what he was citing as a founding document of our American democracy, Lincoln was lifting up the values of democracy beyond how they're inscribed in a Constitution that assigns 3/5 of a person for slaveholders to get credit for their slaves when it comes to apportionment in the House of Representatives. He was pointing to a document that begins, we hold these truths to be self-evident, right, that all men are created equal. And of course we challenge the man word there, but the point is, if all are created equal, we can't go blathering on about states' rights when that is exactly the issue at stake. But what I want to suggest is that the transformation Lincoln was accomplishing there, from these United States in the plural to the United States as a singular entity that we want to be, it was in some sense what philosophers of language would call performative. He's trying to make something be more true through that language, rather than just describe what's already the case. And this is the brilliance of the best orators, is that the way they speak enlivens an ideal and puts it there in our lives in a way that it wasn't before. And in this case, the very ideal of democracy itself, I would suggest. Flash forward from there to the early 1960s, when people marched with Dr. Martin Luther King in the South primarily. Clearly, what they were marching for was that ideal, that all men are created equal. Clearly, that was the case. And in days since then, it's sometimes been less clear, but one of the things in an essay in Why We Can't Wait from 1963, Dr. King says, to speak of equal rights is to speak of equal opportunity. If opportunity is not equal, the rights are not real. And so if my whole reflection on white privilege and about how it's touched my life and my daughter's life, if there's anything to that, we have yet to come to a point of real equality. So I want to suggest when we think back to those monuments, the issue of those monuments is not how they lived in the past, but the role they may play in our present as barriers to our future, as perceived barriers to opportunity. Imagine the child that sees that wonderful, amazing tableau on Stone Mountain every morning on her way to school and sees those great Confederate generals. I don't want to suggest that with the Confederate monuments of any of our towns, the problem with them is the pedestals on which they have been placed. It's not the recognition that this happened. It's that we lift it up. It's that we lift up a General Lee who said, no war monuments. We don't want to be valorizing war and creating more of it. We don't want to lift up Jefferson Davis. However much integrity these men had, we don't want to lift up what they stood for or fought for. We don't want to lift up sedition. We don't want to lift up slavery, or in the sense of states' rights that says the state has a right to anything, even at the expense of democracy and even at the expense of equal rights. However you parse that out. So if we don't want to lift up those things, if we don't want the pedestals underneath them to be barriers to the people that they're looking down on, people of color, for instance, then it's not perhaps that we need to destroy those monuments that were put up in many cases under reconstruction. We need, in fact, to deconstruct them. We need to put them into a context where they are not lifted up to look down on those who don't share that heritage. We need to put them in a context. Well, how do we put them in a different context? We might move them to a different museum. We might put them in a park. You know what? There's no real easy, cost-effective, practical solution in any case, and that has a consequence that I like. We have to talk about what we're going to do. So I think that this calls us to democracy and to our own democratic lives from the ground up, from the communities we live in. It calls us to recognize that to be in a democratic society is to depend on each other. It's to say, we can't move forward at all until a majority of people come to be of the opinion that that's where we want to go. So if we want to go somewhere we're not going yet or not going now, or if we want to change things, the only way to do that is for people's hearts and minds and how they see things to be a little bit different. And the only way we get there, I suggest, is more through, I shouldn't say the only, but conversation, I think, is perhaps a more attractive road in that direction than browbeating of whatever form. So if we do require a conversation, if we're going to transcend identity politics, I believe it's possible that in that focus on a democratic ideal, as opposed to the identities and the rights of identities and groups, if we can look toward the equality of all, if we can look toward opportunity for all, if we can focus on those values, which I believe most of us really do share, then I see in America where our children and our grandchildren to come could move toward their future in a more united state, toward a greater America, the one promised in that Declaration.